What if the greatest villain in the history of Western religion was never a villain at all? What if the man whose name became a synonym for treachery, whose kiss became the universal symbol of deception, was actually the only person in the entire story who understood what was really happening? What if betrayal, the very word that has haunted him for 2,000 years, was in truth an act of the deepest love and the highest courage anyone in that room was capable of? Seekers of ancient wisdom, tonight we are not going to look at a familiar story through familiar eyes. We are going to pry open a door that was sealed by fire, buried in sand, sold on a black market, and nearly lost forever. A door that leads to a version of events so unsettling that the men who first read it tried to erase it from human memory entirely. Somewhere beneath the golden light of every crucifix, beneath every painting of a kiss in a garden, there exists another account, whispered instead of proclaimed, hidden instead of preached. And it asks a question that religious authorities have spent 2 millennia trying to silence. What if the crucifixion was not a tragedy inflicted upon a helpless victim, but a carefully arranged exit, engineered by 2 men who both understood something about the nature of this world that the other disciples were never allowed to know? What if the physical universe itself, the one you are sitting in right now, was never meant to be your final home, and one man was chosen, in secret, to help another man leave it behind? Stay with me tonight, because by the time we reach the end of this journey, you may never read the word betrayal the same way again. Close your eyes for a moment and let yourself drift backward, past the centuries, past the printing press, past the councils and creeds, until you land in the dust and heat of 2nd century Egypt. Picture Alexandria at dusk, when the sun bleeds orange over the harbor, and the great lighthouse begins to burn against a darkening sky. The streets are thick with the smell of crushed cardamom, river mud, and burning oil lamps. Merchants haggle in a dozen languages at once. Greek philosophers argue beside Egyptian priests, and in the shadowed back rooms of private homes, small circles of believers gather to read texts that will never be allowed inside the growing, increasingly powerful churches of the Roman world. This is not the polished, unified Christianity you were taught in school. This is a chaotic, dangerous, electric moment in history, when dozens of competing visions of who Jesus was and what he actually taught were still fighting for survival. Among these communities were groups we now call Gnostics, from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, not belief, not obedience, but direct, personal, experiential knowledge of the divine. And it was within this world, sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, that a Greek text now known as the Gospel of Judas was composed. This world of ancient Alexandria was not some fringe backwater of religious experimentation. It was one of the great intellectual capitals of the ancient world, home to a legendary library, a crossroads where Egyptian mystery traditions, Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and this new movement centered on a crucified teacher from Galilee all collided. In such an environment, dozens of gospels circulated, dozens of communities each claiming to preserve the authentic teaching of Jesus, each convinced the others had gotten it dangerously wrong. There was no single, agreed-upon Christianity in this era, only a fierce, unresolved contest over the meaning of the crucifixion itself, and the Gospel of Judas emerged from one faction within that contest. A faction that read the cross not as a defeat imposed by hostile powers, but as a doorway opened by design. We know of its existence first through the words of its enemies. Around the year 180, a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyons wrote a furious treatise called Against Heresies, and inside it, he condemned a fictitious history, which they style the Gospel of Judas. He was disgusted by it, he wanted it gone. And for nearly 18 centuries, that is exactly what happened. The text vanished so completely that most scholars assumed it had been destroyed forever, another casualty of the long, brutal process by which one version of Christianity crushed all its rivals and rewrote the record of what had actually been debated in those early, fragile centuries. Then, in the 1970s, in a cave near El Minya, Egypt, along the banks of the Nile, farmers discovered a limestone box containing a leather-bound papyrus codex, Nobody in that moment understood what they were holding. What followed was a journey that reads like a thriller. The manuscript was smuggled through Egypt, hidden in a bank vault in New York, left to deteriorate in unstable conditions for years, nearly sold for scrap to art dealers who had no idea what they possessed, and at one devastating point. Placed inside a freezer, an act that caused irreversible damage, shattering the fragile papyrus into thousands of brittle fragments. Entire pages crumbled to dust, ink flaked away. For over 2 decades, this astonishing document sat in obscurity and decay, its secrets slowly disintegrating, until a Swiss foundation finally acquired it, and a painstaking restoration effort, involving conservators piecing together fragments like a 2,000-year-old puzzle, brought the surviving text back into the light. In 2006, the National Geographic Society announced its translation to the world, and the reaction was seismic. Because what this text revealed was not a minor variation on the familiar gospel story. It was a complete inversion of everything the dominant church had spent centuries insisting was true. In this account, Jesus does not view Judas as his enemy. Jesus laughs at the other disciples for their shallow understanding, pulls Judas aside privately, and tells him something extraordinary, that he will exceed all of them, because he alone will sacrifice the man that clothes me. A cryptic phrase that Gnostic scholars interpret as the physical body, the fleshly vessel that Jesus, in this cosmology, viewed as a prison rather than a gift. Imagine being Judas in that moment, standing in candlelight, feeling the weight of a secret so enormous it could shatter your sense of yourself. Chosen not for punishment, but for a mission so sacred that history would spend 2,000 years cursing your name, because it could never afford to understand what you had actually done. Consider, too, what it must have felt like to be a member of one of these small Alexandrian circles, holding a papyrus scroll that directly contradicted the story being preached in the growing churches around you. Knowing that possessing such a text could mark you as a heretic in the eyes of an increasingly organized and increasingly powerful religious authority, these were not passive readers. They were people risking real social, and sometimes physical danger to preserve a version of the story they believed carried something essential, something the official account had flattened and simplified beyond recognition. This is precisely why the survival of the Codex Tchacos feels almost impossible. Texts like this were not simply forgotten. They were actively hunted, confiscated, and destroyed during the long process by which Orthodoxy consolidated its power across the Roman world. What we hold today is not one surviving copy among many. It is closer to a single whisper that somehow escaped a chorus of silence that lasted 18 centuries. Now let us step back from the incense and the dust and ask why this mattered so much that a bishop felt compelled to publicly denounce it, why an entire strand of early Christian thought had to be buried rather than debated. Because underneath the strange, alien language of ancient Gnostic cosmology lies a psychological architecture that modern depth psychology would spend the next 1800 years rediscovering from scratch. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who devoted his life to mapping the unconscious mind, became fascinated by Gnostic texts precisely because he recognized in them a sophisticated, symbolic language describing internal processes of the human psyche, disguised as external cosmic drama. In Jungian terms, the material world of Gnostic thought, ruled over by a flawed, ignorant creator god called the Demiurge, functions as a symbol for the ego, the false, limited self we mistake for our entire identity. The Demiurge believes he is the only god, the ultimate authority, exactly as the ego believes it is the whole of who we are, unaware of a deeper, transcendent reality it cannot perceive from within its own limited framework. And this is where the story of Judas becomes something far more universal than a religious dispute about first-century theology. Jung would recognize immediately what the Gospel of Judas is actually describing, the archetype of the necessary betrayer, the figure who must be cast into darkness, misunderstood, reviled, and sacrificed, so that a deeper transformation can occur. In shadow work, the branch of Jungian psychology dealing with the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, and project outward onto others, there is always a figure who must do the unbearable thing, who must break the comfortable illusion so that something truer can be born. Judas, in this reading, is not the opposite of Christ. He is the necessary shadow function that allows the entire transformative process to unfold, the part of the psyche willing to be hated, willing to be misunderstood, willing to sacrifice its own reputation for eternity, so that liberation can occur for someone else. To understand the Demiurge fully, we have to understand the myth that produces him, because Gnostic cosmology rarely stays static. It keeps unfolding in layers, and each layer maps onto something recognizable in the architecture of the mind. In many Gnostic systems, the Demiurge is himself the accidental offspring of a higher being called Sophia, meaning wisdom, who in her longing to know the unknowable source directly, without an intermediary, generates a flawed creation without full awareness of what she has done. Sophia's error, her overreaching desire, her creation of something incomplete and mistaken for whole, mirrors almost exactly what modern psychology calls the formation of the ego during early childhood, a necessary but ultimately partial construction, never intended to be mistaken for the totality of what a person actually is. The Archons, the lesser cosmic powers said to serve the Demiurge and enforce his illusion of absolute rule, function symbolically as the internalized voices of shame and conditioning that police the boundaries of the ego, punishing any impulse that threatens to expose its limitations. When ancient initiates spoke of ascending past the Archons on the soul's journey after death, offering each guardian a secret password of recognition, they were encoding a map of psychological liberation, a stepwise recognition of each layer of internalized fear that keeps a person imprisoned within a smaller version of themselves. There is a reason this framework resonates so strangely with our current cultural moment, and it has nothing to do with religion at all. Gnostic cosmology describes the physical world as an illusion, a flawed simulation of a higher, truer reality, constructed by a lesser power that either does not know, or deliberately conceals, the existence of something greater beyond it. Strip away the ancient religious vocabulary, and what you are left with is something eerily close to modern simulation theory, the idea, taken seriously by physicists and philosophers alike, that the reality we experience as solid and absolute may in fact be a constructed layer, sitting atop a deeper, hidden substrate of information we cannot directly perceive. Quantum physics itself has spent the last century dismantling our naive assumptions about the solidity of matter, revealing a universe built from probability waves that only collapse into fixed form the moment they are observed. A universe where the observer and the observed appear to be locked in a strange, inseparable relationship. Neuroscience tells us that the brain does not passively record reality. It actively constructs the experience of reality from fragments of sensory data, filling gaps, editing out anomalies, generating a coherent movie that feels absolute but is, technically, a simulation running on biological hardware. When ancient Gnostic teachers spoke of awakening from the sleep of matter, of piercing the veil of the Demiurge's false creation, they were describing, in the symbolic language available to them, the same fundamental insight that modern cognitive science now describes in the language of neural construction and perceptual filtering. This is not primitive superstition dressed up as mysticism. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated psychological technology, encoded in myth, because myth was the only vessel capable of carrying such dangerous, destabilizing insight safely across generations, without collapsing entirely into abstraction. Consider also what neuroscientists now call the default mode network, a cluster of brain regions responsible for generating our persistent sense of being a continuous, separate self moving through time. Researchers studying meditation and contemplative states have observed that when activity in this network quiets, subjects consistently report a dissolving of the boundary between self and world, a felt sense of unity they often describe, independently of any religious background, in language remarkably close to what ancient mystics called gnosis. The self, in other words, appears to be less a fixed fact of nature and more an ongoing construction, a finding that would not have surprised a single scribe who copied the Gospel of Judas by candlelight, because they had already arrived. Through contemplative practice, rather than laboratory instruments, at the same fundamental insight. So when Jesus tells Judas, in this forbidden gospel, that he will sacrifice the man that clothes me, the ancient audience listening to that line was not hearing a simple story about a body being killed. They were hearing a teaching about the necessity of releasing identification with the constructed self, the ego, the Demiurge's clothing, in order for the deeper, luminous self to be liberated. Judas becomes the agent of that liberation precisely because he is willing to be hated for it. He becomes the one disciple whose love is strong enough, and whose understanding is deep enough, to perform the single most misunderstood act in religious history, an act that looks, from the outside, like the ultimate betrayal, but which, from within the cosmology of the text itself, is the ultimate gift. This inversion, this deliberate scandal, is exactly why the early institutional church could not permit the Gospel of Judas to survive, a faith built on hierarchy, obedience, and the clear division between righteous insiders and damned outsiders cannot easily accommodate a story in which the most reviled figure in its foundational narrative turns out to be the most spiritually awakened person in the room. Let us bring this back from the incense-filled rooms of ancient Alexandria into your own life tonight, because the deepest truths encoded in these forbidden texts are not meant to remain locked in history. They are meant to be lived. Ask yourself, honestly, where in your own life are you playing the role of the frightened disciples, clinging to the comfortable version of events, refusing to see what is actually happening, because the truth would cost you your sense of certainty? And where, in some quieter, more courageous part of yourself, are you being called to play the role of Judas, to do the difficult, misunderstood thing that your own inner circle of comfortable habits and safe self-images will call a betrayal, but which is actually the only path toward a deeper liberation? This is not abstract. This shows up in ending a relationship everyone around you insists you should keep. This shows up in leaving a career others believe you were foolish to abandon, in speaking a truth that fractures a friendship built on convenient silence, in setting a boundary that the people benefiting from your old, compliant self will experience as an unforgivable act of treachery. Every genuine transformation requires a Judas moment, a willingness to be seen as the villain by people who cannot yet perceive the larger pattern you are stepping into. Here is a practice you can begin tonight, a symbolic ritual drawn directly from the psychological core of this ancient text. Find a quiet space and light a single candle if you are able. Close your eyes and bring to mind the parts of your current identity, your habits, your fears, your outdated roles, that you sense are no longer serving your growth, the man that clothes you, in the language of the text. Do not judge these parts. Simply witness them, the way Judas witnessed the body of Jesus, with clarity rather than cruelty. Then, silently or aloud, speak these words, or words like them. I release what I have outgrown, not as betrayal, but as liberation. Sit with that sentence for several long, slow breaths. Notice where in your body you feel resistance, tightness, fear of judgment from others. This is the Demiurge's voice, the ego's final protest, the part of you convinced that release equals annihilation. Breathe through it. Practice this daily, even for 3 or 4 minutes, and you will begin cultivating what the ancient Gnostics called gnosis, direct, felt knowledge that you are not identical to the roles you have been playing, that a deeper, more luminous awareness exists beneath the surface performance of your everyday personality, patiently waiting to be uncovered. This is the work we return to again and again on this channel, Seekers, the slow, deliberate excavation of wisdom that was never meant to be lost, wisdom that survived fire, burial, decay, and centuries of deliberate suppression, because something in it refused to fully disappear. You who have stayed until this final moment are not casual viewers. You are becoming something closer to the original circles who gathered in candlelit rooms in ancient Alexandria, hungry not for comfortable answers, but for uncomfortable truths. Willing to sit with a story that unsettles the categories you were handed by others. So here is the question I want you to carry with you long after this video ends, and I want you to sit with it honestly before you answer. Who is the Judas figure in your own story right now? The misunderstood act, the necessary rupture, the relationship or belief or identity you sense you are being called to release, even though everyone around you will call it a betrayal. Write your answer below, however raw or unfinished it feels, because this circle grows stronger every time one of us speaks a truth instead of a performance. And if these words found you at exactly the moment you needed them, if something in you recognized this teaching before I even finished explaining it, leave these 4 words in the comments below. So the rest of this circle knows you have crossed the threshold with us tonight. Release the sacred mask. Until the next hidden text finds its way back into the light, stay awake, seekers. Stay unafraid of the parts of your story the world insists on calling betrayal.